brilliant. Oh, great. Can everyone hear us okay? Excellent. I see thumbs up. I'm going to take that as a yes. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and thanks very much to Anthony for opening the conference. Unsurprisingly, our first panel is on AI and the opportunities in the decade ahead. I think, lots of people have been in this space for a long time. We might remember reports from 4 or 5 years ago talking about the productivity benefits of AI, how it's going to change the economy, how it's going to change public services, and it kind of felt quite far off and sort of, yeah, we'll deal with that when we get there. And then all of a sudden, we had the release of ChatGPT, generative AI boom. The public got to actually feel and test what AI looks like, and all of those possibilities that we saw in policy reports, projections about the economy, all feel a lot more real. And it also feels like there's a bit of a race on to get there first. So our panel discussion this morning is really to look at where is the UK in that race? How can we seize the opportunities? What are the challenges we need to overcome on the way to get there? And we're going to try and get into the real meat and practicality of what that will be like. And luckily, I don't have to talk about that very much because I've got an excellent panel who's going to do all the talking for me. So delighted to welcome Kirsty, who's the Director of Technology at Labour Together, a think tank that's focused on the policy ideas that a Keir Starmer government would deliver after the election. We have Dr. Saira Ghafur, the lead for digital health at the Institute of Global Health and Innovation at Imperial College London, but someone who's working also on the ground in the deployment of health technologies. And also Chloe McEwen, a senior director at Microsoft, which, as you all well know, is a big investor in this thing we called AI. So I'm going to kick off the panel, and just some housekeeping rules first. We're not doing opening remarks at this conference. What we're going to do is jump straight into the questions, offer our panelists a chance to respond while introducing themselves, and then crack on to the next topic so we can get as much out of our speakers as we can in the 45 minutes we have them. And we'll aim to take some audience questions just before the end of the discussion. Now, the first question, I'm going to come to Chloe and Kirsty. So last month, we saw the UK government set out its approach to the AI white paper. Lots of discussion about whether that was the right approach, whether it was a wrong approach. I really want to get your sort of take on, was this the right approach or was it a missed opportunity? What do we need to do to kind of build on it and bring it forward? So Chloe, I'm going to go to you for your reflections first.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Neil, I think it's worth kicking off with the fact that you said it was a race. And I think we completely endorse the fact that it's a race. And you said, did the government get it right or wrong? Well, maybe we need to take a step back and think, well, what is the context of this race? And it's global. And in a global race, where does the UK sit in that? And how does the UK respond? And how does government put the UK in the best possible international position to take the opportunity? And so I think from our perspective, we'd say, the response, the government's response to the white paper has been really sound. It's worth remembering that, the UK is playing a leading international role. We had the UK AI Safety Summit, and I think we'd say that, that Safety Summit put us in a really good place, but we'd also say, remember that in a global race, we should look at the US, the White House commitments on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI. Look at the G7 declaration, look at the OECD, and just remember that I think for the UK to be successful, we need really coherent, interoperable regulation across borders. Because what we see often is that, and I think you mentioned it in your 7 points this morning, you don't want divergence for the sake of divergence just because you can do it differently. You really want to be putting the UK in a position where it can harness those benefits and where you minimize friction and you enable the opportunity and enable people to move in a swift way. I think, so I said avoid fragmentation and then maybe thinking about definitions. Definitions are quite important, and that's what international institutions are working on. And so when we have these debates, I think we need to be clear what we're really talking about. So the UK could play a role here with kind of aligning some of the consensus definitions that are coming out of OECD. And then, also thinking about risk assessments and mitigation and thinking about, consistent measures so that we create this really international interoperable framework that has, the right principles across Western democracies. So that's, I guess that leaves us really with 3 points. So it's kind of international regulation, national authorities that coordinate There will be sovereignty elements in that, but I suppose each country will want to think about its own sovereign elements. And then finally, maybe to close out, coordinated standards development, because, having standards in this area is also important, and countries will want to work, consistently across borders.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what I'm hearing from you is the approach seems broadly right, but there's a lot to do below the surface to make sure that it actually operationalizes properly, and particularly that kind of standardization, harmonization element is key.
Yeah.
Kirsty, I'm going to turn to you next, because obviously, Labour Together, the Labour Party, others have been thinking about how they use AI for Labour government. Well, there's lots of policy development going on at the same time, so I don't envy you having to kind of respond in real time, like what's going on. Give us your take on sort of from where you're sitting.
Yeah, well, far be it from me to compliment the government. I think the actual response to the white paper was a really comprehensive piece of policy work, so all credit to the officials that worked on that for doing exactly what you just described and making policy in a context that's changing by the day. What I think is a missed opportunity is the political framing and the strategic approach that the government's taken to AI, where the focus has been really disproportionately on the catastrophic risks and the kind of future potential of AI, where, understandably that's kind of media catnip and it gets you a lot of profile at the expense of risks and harms that are with us already that we know people are concerned about, like bias, impact on workers, misinformation. There's a lot of opportunities and of risks to AI that I think haven't had the political bandwidth and therefore the discussion and the airing in public that they should have if we're going to really make the most of this. And don't get me wrong, I think this is a hugely transformative technology and it's going to affect pretty much every aspect of our lives. So what I think is the missed opportunity in the government's approach so far is taking that into account and upgrading capability across the public sector, not just having concentrated pools of expertise looking at the frontier models in AZ, but thinking about how AI is going to change what we need from our education and skills system, from benefits from the whole of our regulatory architecture. So I think, that kind of slightly science fiction edge approach has taken away from some of the attention that should be going to what we're doing right now to help people get to grips with it and make the most of the benefits.
Okay, it's very interesting. I remember whenever the ChatGPT hype was happening, and my grandmother, who lives in East Kilbride in Scotland, does not really think about technology very much, called me up and said, "Neil, what's an LLM and should I be worried?" And I was like, this has gone very far away. So I definitely get that framing point. Saira, I want to kind of come to you next, which is, there's the regulatory structure, there's what policymakers and officials decide, but then you've kind of got to put this stuff into practice on the ground. What's your take as someone who's at the kind of front line of where this technology is being rolled out on the UK's approach, and what should we be thinking about when it comes to the next steps?
So again, very much agree with what Kirsty and Chloe were saying, that it's a very comprehensive piece of work, but actually translating it into reality is very different. So from a healthcare sector perspective, we've got the MHRA that really guide in terms of what's kind of coming out into the market, but when you kind of see the hype versus the reality, it's very different in terms of the evidence behind AI tools and what's actually out in the market. Very few studies and very few actual tools being used. A lot of the problem is the guidance that's put out by regulatory bodies, and certainly what the guidance included was lots of voluntary measures that are not going to be put into practice. And I think that is one of the big mistakes that is potentially going to disrupt, or not disrupt, but certainly hold back some of this innovation. I think innovators certainly need a strict, albeit be innovation friendly, but a kind of strict set of guidelines that kind of work cross-border as well. And I think once you kind of leave it as a voluntary effort, I think it becomes very difficult then, once the kind of cat's out the bag, to try and rein it in. And I think we've seen this already in healthcare when you look at interoperability of different systems, and that's been very much a voluntary thing. And now that's a huge problem in healthcare in terms of making sure that we are interoperable across the system. And I think we're missing a big opportunity in AI by not having that kind of regulation set and guidance.
That's a really interesting point. It was picked up by the three panellists. I'd be interested to come back to your thoughts on this. Is, the argument the government would make is the technology's not developed yet. We need to kind of take it as it goes, develop it along. and respond to events. But you just highlighted a very clear practical example of, well, actually sometimes voluntary standards don't work that well when you get into the kind of real meat of it. So what's your sort of response to this, the point the government would make back and saying, but we have to kind of be more flexible? I'll maybe start with you, Saira, and then go back along the path.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to be flexible in healthcare. There is no flexibility in getting it wrong. When you're diagnosing someone's cancer, there isn't that flexibility of we can get this wrong. You need to make sure that you've got those regulations in place, and that's very much for the safety. And I think, as Kirsty had already mentioned, there's things like bias that we're very much aware of this. And again, in kind of health technology, bias is already inbuilt because the bias is in the data that's already being used to train AI models on. So we need to be able to pick that up. That needs to be set in guidance and not be a voluntary measure. So I think already you're going to perpetuate all of these issues if you don't kind of have that guidance in place for innovators, albeit make it very much innovation friendly. Give the long lead times for innovators to be able to demonstrate it, be more kind of flexible in terms of being able to produce the evidence, but they need to be able to demonstrate that. And actually for innovators, if you've got a set of, this is what I need to do, this is what I need the investment to be able to do this, you know, you can get that in place. But when it's voluntary, it's kind of, do I do some of this, do I do some of that?
Yeah.
And actually, if you need to be able to demonstrate that in other markets as well, you might as well do that all properly the first time round and be able to use it across the board.
That's very interesting. So I guess the gap is that the regulators are going to be asked to deliver this on their behalf, and that's, you know...
Yeah, and it's very, very difficult because actually it is rapidly changing, and that's going to be one of the issues that we need to grapple with, but you do need it in place for certain.
Kirsty, Chloe, I don't know if you've got any reflections on that discussion.
I mean, I think it's about how you approach regulation, isn't it? And the UK, this is something the UK does really well, which is focusing on outcomes and not being too prescriptive about the process. And as you say, as Saira says, I mean, there is no flexibility for getting things wrong. Therefore, you need to focus on the outcome that you want to get to, and that allows flexibility for correction and for alteration when something is, you know, when a process is not being done the right way. And it also underlines, for me, the importance that in the end, these are tools for humans to do their jobs better, and you always want a human in charge, accountable and in the loop, and we must never forget that. These are to enable us to be better at what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard challenge. How do you leave open space for innovation and, you know, resist the temptation to do knee-jerk or overly heavy-handed policy responses, but at the same time take responsibility for setting the framework and spotting where something needs state involvement. There's a whole kind of science of regulatory agility and a whole sort of whole evolution in almost the way we go about managing that interaction between state, looking after the public interest, and private sector generally, pushing forward the boundaries of innovation. And I think there are moves in that direction, and I think the UK has some good kind of background in this science of regulatory innovation, but there's a lot more that needs to happen. And when you look at the way tech policy has been managed in this country over the past few years, it's clear we are much too slow. Like, you know, we announced when we left the EU in 2020 that we'd be reviewing data protection rules in the UK. 4 years later, we still don't know what is the rules of the road for how you manage data. That's not an environment that supports uptake of new technologies or innovation. Likewise, the Online Safety Act, you know, it was 7 years between the white paper coming out and the thing being finalised. That's not a viable way to go forwards with this. We've got to find new models. And part of that will be about making sure that we empower the regulators that we have, we give them expertise, we give them levers, and we trust them to innovate and to try new things. And Peter Carl announced that Labour would set up a regulatory innovation office, and part of the purpose of that would be to support that and kind of recognise that government is no longer going to legislate once in a generation and then sit back and see what happens. It just won't work.
Yeah, it does very much feel like in this discussion, and we've been having it for a long time, that something's going to have to give in the way that we think about policy and regulation of this space. But equally, we're going to have to somehow satisfy the people operating live in the market to give them the kind of confidence to be like, well, I can use this stuff, the liability frameworks in place, etc. So I think that's definitely something we might not be able to answer today, but it's certainly an essay question everyone can go away with. Just moving on a bit, so one of the interesting things I find about this discussion is people talk about AI almost more like industrial policy now. It's tech was often talked about as a kind of regulatory policy issue if you think about data protection and online safety. But AI obviously has a very hard physical edge to it, data centers, compute capacity, etc. I was interested to kind of get the panel's take, and I'm going to start with Chloe, about when you build an industrial strategy for technology or anything else, there are choices, right? You've got to pick the thing that the UK is going to do well at, the thing that we might sort of import from abroad, and the areas we might collaborate around. So Chloe, I wanted to take your take as someone sitting in, one of the big leading developers of this stuff. What are the kind of UK's strengths, and what choices do you think we should be making?
It's a nice, easy one.
Yeah.
Well, look, you're absolutely right to be bringing the discussion onto industrial strategy first, because, and it kind of leads on nicely from Kirsty, from what you were saying. I mean, we lost some time, having legislation in Parliament on other matters, which meant that some years were lost that might have been deployed in other ways, and that's happened. So now we are where we are. So we do need to think about, well, a few things. So where do you place the big bets, and where do you? It's not so much decide to be strong, but where do you kind of adopt what you've got and make the best of it? And as you say, Neil, what are we now going to do? So, first of all, I'd say thinking of industrial strategy, need to observe how AI is going to be deployed. And we always say, look at the different layers of the stack, and at the top you've got the deployers, and UK is really, really strong on that deployment of AI. And you need regulatory architecture that maps to those layers. So think of Online Safety Act, think of existing legislation, think of data legislation. That all already applies. You don't really need anything new there. Then you've got the large language models, and there, we've heard people talking about licensing models for those. Probably makes good sense. And then thinking about the infrastructure. So again, those are hosted in cloud, and then for those you need data centers. And we at Microsoft, announced investment in, AI data centers in the autumn, which obviously form a very, very important part of the UK being able to take part in this global race. Now, there's going to be huge demand, and that demand is growing. So obviously, if you're government, you want to make sure that you have the provision for energy that you need, the planning that you need, working with government to, on all of those things. You need the data centers, and then obviously the large language models, and then the talent, the developers. And it's not for us to say where should those go, but it does make sense for government to look at, well, where do we have those strengths now? Where can we get that first mover advantage? Mm-hmm. And I'd say probably it's closer to the top, isn't it? We already have, a lot of talent, a lot of software development. We've got fantastic use cases in health. We're really, health and social care. I was talking to a colleague of mine who was saying that, in Barnsley, they are now using AI. It's cut down their time to do all of the forms, and now they spend more time on home visits, going out and having the human interaction. And again, fantastic use case. So probably it's at the top layer of deployment, and certainly what Microsoft has been doing. We've just launched our open access principles so that we can enable as many software app developers to have access to large language models in order to really superpower that top layer, which we're really excited about for the UK.
And Saira, I'll just come back to you on that one, because it's actually in health where most of the examples come from. It's the one that politicians are using the most. It's the one the opposition is using the most. And we've just seen £3.5 billion announced for deployment. I wonder how would you sort of rate the UK out of 10 in terms of its deployment of health technologies? And what do you think are some of the real barriers that we need to get over to make it happen faster? Because it's all well and good to say, I'm going to run this through the health service, but the health service is a complicated beast, and there are lots of traps along the way.
Yeah, I think this is always a problem, isn't it? We talk about the NHS, it's this behemoth organisation, but actually underlying all of that, it's tens of thousands of different size organisations that all have their own autonomous structures. So deployments actually, you would think in a nationalised health service, deployment would be much easier compared to, say, the US, but actually we've got so many stumbling blocks in place. And I'd say you'd kind of separate it into people, process, and then actually the policy angle. So in terms of people, we just don't train doctors, nurses, other healthcare professionals on how AI is going to be used, how it's going to affect their jobs, and how it's going to improve their actual work-life balance as well. And that people piece comes into patients as well. So I work as a respiratory doctor as well. I know about tech, so therefore can understand some of the clinical decision support tools and the kind of AI algorithms behind it. But actually, if you're speaking to a lot of clinicians, they've not been trained in any of this, so they're less likely to use it. Also, in that kind of patient doctor or patient clinician interaction, patients expect you to know what you're talking about when it comes to AI deployed tools, and they come having read an article like your grandma, what do I need to know about this? And if you're not able to answer that, then it's that lack of trust in that process. So I think that education piece is really key. Then when it comes into process, we're very good at here's the evidence base behind the AI algorithm, but actually what's the solution evidence as a whole? How does, when we deploy this into practice, what are we comparing it to? What's the incumbent? Is it going to improve? Is it going to save time? Is it going to save money? What's the return on investment? And how likely are people to use it? And then very much the policy angle, we're not really, taking that forward. So in terms of deployment and adoption, we've got massively perverse incentives in the UK at the moment. So you'd think in a national healthcare system, you would have, here's a tool that's brilliant, it's been tested, we've done the due diligence, we've got the evidence, everyone should be using it across the NHS. But what happens is no one's really kind of done that piece. It's not really going out there. And literally, another life as well, I'm co-founder of a startup. You're literally like a car door salesman. You go from place to place trying to sell the same product over and over again. We should not be doing this. And then that perverse incentive comes into when you're not actually reimbursing that technology from a national system. Then innovators think, actually, I'm not going to get my return on investment for this. Why should, if the NHS isn't going to pay for it, why should I invest in the UK? Why should I invest in this, unsexy thing for heart failure compared to this is going to be much better because I can go direct to consumer and I will make my money back, and it's a health and wellness app powered by AI, and it's not really that useful at the end of the day. So this is where I think we need that top-down policy to say, actually, we're going to invest in this area of healthcare, but also the bottom-up as well. Here's how we're going to help innovators come into the market and deploy their tool.
That's something that came up a lot when we were developing our idea for the kind of VPAS system for health technology, was the providers of the health tech would say, well, my investors are pushing me to go to the US because I will get the return on investment straight away there, and there's no method for reimbursement in the UK. Yeah. And where they've been successful, it's taken such a long time to get through, and that's something we're just going to have to, I think, work out how to deal with.
I mean, it's such a huge push for the system, and actually for people, for innovators to actually come to the UK if you've got reimbursement sorted. And actually from the reimbursement perspective, that return on investment, investors want to see that as well. And actually, if you've not got investors investing in the AI, then actually we've got no AI to come to the market either. So I think until we sort that out, we are moving in the right direction though, however. So nice guidance, etc. So the early value assessment framework, that's all helping to move things along. But still, I think we're far away from actually, this is an NHS procured tool, and actually we've done the due diligence, here's the guidance, we suggest you should use this. I think we're very far.
Yeah, so a lot of work still to do to get that off the ground. I'm going to actually maybe offer Kirsty or Chloe a chance to respond to that, because some really interesting thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of wondering, what are the solutions? And it sounds like that's a problem, not just in health, but I mean, across all of the markets we have in the UK, and maybe it's a procurement problem. But there are also just other, issues around what the incentives are, and how can we create the right incentives in the UK to, inspire and innovate and make sure that we are the fastest mover on this. And maybe you guys have some answers.
Yeah, I think this comes up all the time. Like, what is the right sort of organisational structure such that you allow enough differentiation and autonomy, but you've got mechanisms in place such that when someone finds a really good tool or develops best practice, you can grab that and mainstream that and make that accessible to everyone. And I think that really characterises the way AI is looking in public services at the moment. It's just really patchy. You can find some amazing use cases that are saving hundreds of millions of pounds for hospital trusts. You can find brilliant diagnostic tools in place, but by no means everywhere. So at the moment, it totally depends on the ingenuity and the risk appetite, I think, of the individual people and organisations involved. And I do think there's things that government could do to give people across the public sector more confidence that they can investigate these tools and start to explore them, start to apply them.
I think a really good example, sorry, I'll just jump in.
Crack on.
A brilliant example, it's not quite AI, but continuous glucose monitors for type 1 diabetics. I think it's one of the best inventions out in the market at the moment. But what I'm saying about the top-down policy and the bottom-up as well. So this came from the Accelerated Access Review about bringing these onto the market. So this was part of the 5-year forward view and then the forward plan after that. But it's very much how do you kind of improve healthcare for type 1 diabetics. The money was, the capital investment was there. It was very much working with innovators as well and actually working with, you know, the bottom up, working with patients, working with the diabetic charities, working with primary care, which we always kind of forget to do, is actually communicate with the people who are having to do this. And actually that top down, bottom up shifted that from, say, maybe 2% of type 1 diabetics had this innovation, and now we're up to, I think, 35% of type 1 diabetics are using continuous glucose monitors, and that impact that that will have on like outcomes, health outcomes, saving money in terms of, I think, a quarter of hospital admissions are diabetics, and actually that future wellness piece as well, it's a huge shift, and I think that's very much looking at the incentives but also looking at policy there to help guide it. And I think if we can use that sort of approach to AI in healthcare and certainly other sectors as well, I think is a huge shift that you can make.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And using those case studies is particularly powerful to work out what's going well before and what you need to do to kind of roll it through. Well, I've just got a couple more questions for our panel, and then it's over to you guys. So do think about those questions, and we'll come to you very shortly. But Kirsty, just to come to you, you talked about it at the start, and this is something I know Labour Together has been looking a lot into, which is how do you frame the AI discussion for the public and make them want to engage and uptake it? What's your sort of take on that as we're now heading towards an election where this could become an issue that's talked about in the news or even on the doorstep?
Yeah, we think about that all the time. I think at the moment people are a bit confused because the way AI is discussed by the government is kind of schizophrenic. So at some moments it's a terrifying, potentially dystopian risk factor that robots are going to destroy us all and we need an urgent summit to mitigate that risk. By the way, I think we do need international coordination to mitigate catastrophic risk. Absolutely, that's necessary, but not sufficient. At other moments, AI is this wonderful thing that's going to benefit us all, and we're best friends with Elon Musk and having a cosy chat about how UK and Elon can work together. Like, I think that is very weird and has left people with a sort of nagging sense that the government hasn't gripped this. And so I think that we do need a more coherent strategy, and we do need a more kind of just sensible take, recognising that, yes, this is a huge deal. Yes, there are enormous opportunities, and to be able to grab those, we have to do much better in the way we talk to people and engage them, and do transparency and democratic participation, such that people that are going to be affected by the way these tools are used have a say in the rules governing that. We need to do much better at being clear-eyed about where there are problems arising. So I think that we do need to do something really quickly about deepfakes. I think, I hope I'm wrong about this, but I think there's a scandal waiting to happen whereby in a few months we will find that, like teenage girls all over the country are having nudes with their face on it circulated around the class. Or, I think there are, where there are really acute problems arising, I think you need to see faster action to reassure people that government will move when it needs to. And I think all that feeds into the kind of general public understanding of these tools, which in general, the UK is in a good place. So historically, UK public is quite comfortable with tech and quite open to it, and we have been early adopters on things like e-commerce and online banking. There's no reason why the British public, isn't open to seeing these tools used by businesses, used by public services. But there is a there's a specific sort of doubt and worry about the term AI. If you ask the same question about whether you want technology to be applied in the health service or whether you want AI to be applied, you get very different answers. And I think that's as this kind of it's kind of the way AI has raced up the public agenda has caused people to start asking these questions about what are the long-term impacts and consequences for what our society looks like, and they just don't feel like at the moment government is gripping it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and we think about this all the time because with an election coming up, I would say if you looked at the Parliament at the moment and said, is AI and technology a good or bad thing, you would get a majority of people saying that it is. But there's clearly a scenario where if some of this starts to go wrong, if we start to see a poor redistribution of technology jobs and people say losing work in one place but growing in another, we could see that balance within Parliament shift, and that would put not just the UK government but also business community in a worse position because we wouldn't have a kind of broadly pro-tech polity basically overseeing it. So it's something I agree we need to really focus on over the next few months. Just before I turn over to audience questions, I started off by talking about how ChatGPT was in the first way the public got to kind of access and play with AI. I wonder just quickly from each of you, what do you think that kind of next moment might be where people sort of realise, this technology is here and it's going to make a difference for good or for bad? I might start off with Saira and then make my way along the panel.
In terms of what people might...
Yeah, what's the next thing where they're going to see it in their real lives that's going to feel like that's affected them?
Again, I'll go back to the healthcare perspective. I think actually that whole shift, so we've already seen people using the NHS app more, and this is post, or using it through COVID, and now actually people using it on a more day-to-day basis when they're interacting with healthcare organisations. And I think actually applying more AI to that, we're kind of moving from that generalised healthcare to, personalised, to moving to hyper-personalised healthcare. I think it's going to be a huge shift, and I think really kind of employing or using that wealth of data that we have, albeit disparate, albeit it's not in a great place at the moment, but certainly we're moving towards that investment and that shift towards using data much better in the healthcare system, and actually people seeing it in terms of their interactions with healthcare through their kind of, whether it's a kind of patient passport, using the app, etc. And it's more suited towards them as opposed to something that's more generic.
Brilliant. Kirsty?
Yeah, this was such an interesting question to consider. I was trying to challenge myself to think what is going to be the next sort of retail leap or the next kind of mass market moment. And I know there are loads of firms working on AI personal assistants, and some of those sort of in physical device form. I can see a world where that happens, and you will be routinely using something that is managing a specific set of data that you determine to help you make decisions and access information and kind of just run your life more efficiently day to day. Clearly that raises a whole host of privacy and regulatory and scary Black Mirror-esque unintended consequences style questions, but I think those are probably resolvable, so you might get there. But in the medium term, I think we've got a way to go with people's ingenuity and creativity in just using the tools that are already available. So I think the latest I saw was a third of the public say they're using a generative AI tool at least once a month. That's quite a lot, considering they only became, publicly available in the last couple of years. But we will start to see all sorts of new applications and implications as that number grows. And then third thing I think is the shift from this being something that if you're someone that's interested in tech, you might be playing around, and individuals in organisations are making use of these tools just to support their own work, to organisations having more confidence and starting to institute the use of them and starting to develop their own tools. So that I think the next thing that people start to really be aware of is at work, you might have a model based on your organisation's data that's helping you to process and manage the information that you hold or generate new content. You might find that your school is starting to use AI tools. I think that will be the next stage in people being more aware of the presence of AI in their lives when organisations start to be more confident and bring it into their day-to-day processes.
Chloe?
Yeah, they'll say, how did you use your AI today? So I think it's a tough one, but for me, the prevention in medicine is going to be extraordinary. So, and again, remembering that, I think there's always, you always want an accountable medic, but at the same time, the technology that can, be harnessed in a predictive way that can capture, for example, cancers that were previously undetectable at an earlier stage and cure them is going to be extraordinary. And so I think some of the diseases that have been uncurable or very difficult, the clinical outcomes will completely change.
Amazing. Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got 5 minutes left for Q&A. So what I'm going to suggest is we take 3 questions from the audience, and then I'll turn them over to my panel to respond to them before we wrap up. So I would like a show of hands, please, for questions. I've got one over there, sort of midway up. So we'll take that question first.
Hi there, thanks very much. My name is Niamh Sweeney. I work with Milltown Partners, a communications and public affairs agency. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think one of the most obvious points that you made early doors is that without sort of very clear rules and instructions, it's going to be very hard for sort of high-risk applications of AI to be brought to life in a meaningful way. I'm curious to get the panel's view on how the UK can, I suppose, catch up with the EU that's already implemented its AI Act, passed it, and it'll soon be implemented. Do you feel there's sort of a lost moment here where companies are going to end up falling in with the risk-based approach outlined in the EU's Act versus the sort of domain-specific expertise type approach that the UK would like to pursue, or do you think there's still a separate path that the UK can carve out there?
Great. Okay, I will take a second question. Hands up, please. There's one down at the front here.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. MacEwen from Cisco. I was wondering the panel's views on whether the government should have a role in helping small businesses adopt AI in particular. Thank you.
And do we have a third and final question for the panel? Great. 2 excellent questions that we'll run with. So that first one. Oh, sorry. I didn't see the hand. If we could go up again. Oh, sorry, just there, please. If we could get a mic to this bit here, please.
Thank you. So I work in PwC for the Public Policy and Regulations, and I heard during the panel talks a lot of talks about interoperability. And right now when we talk about AI, obviously it's a massive topic. We talk about it as a walled garden topic. Do we think or started to think about what happens when AI converges with other technologies, being quantum computing, blockchain, XR? I think this is when the problem gets much more complicated, right?
Brilliant. Okay, so 3 excellent questions. The first one on how the UK can catch up with the EU if it's moving first. Secondly, on how to encourage small business adoption. And then that last question on sort of general interoperability and convergence. Any takers for our questions?
Okay, so let's wrap them all up. So EU AI Act, I mean, that is a great and very important question that personally I've given quite a lot of thought to. Actually, I was really pleased when I saw the techUK report this morning with the 7 priorities, because you specifically addressed that question. And so, I tend to agree. I think this is a moment that is a bit different from previous moments, such as, GDPR, where there really was a sense of alignment. And I think that's because companies aren't yet, the scale of commercial opportunity is so vast. And I think that we all haven't yet quite got to grips with what it's going to look like, that the EU AI Act is appropriate for a particular moment, but maybe not for all moments. And so actually I think what the UK government is doing in terms of kind of seeking to look beyond that and looking both to the EU but also at the US and at the White House commitments and at the G7 and at the OECD means that we probably will be able to get to a stage where as long as we focus on outcomes and not prescribe processes and give the developer level the freedom, actually we already have laws that that do what we need at that top level. I think that therefore we haven't missed that moment, and it's probably, and I think we're already actually living that now, to see that we didn't need it and that there are going to be a lot of opportunities there. And that actually feeds into how do we help SMEs adapt. And I think that what's really interesting is government is already looking at that. They've set up an AI Opportunities Forum, and I think that's specifically geared towards thinking about, how can we get and harness those productivity gains of AI? How can we adopt them across the whole economy? And how can we also work on ensuring that we have the skills necessary and the new jobs that, because of course this will change how we work, and really seeking to harness that across the economy as a whole.
Any takers in the final on the questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Chloe. I don't think the EU is the kind of rule setter definitively, and sort of, as widely as we saw with GDPR. I think the UK would be really well advised to think heavily about trying to leave open space for innovation and trying to make sure that the approach to mitigating the risks takes into account that, how fast things are moving. So I don't think we need to rush to follow the EU AI Act by any means. And by the way, I think a lot of this needs to happen at the international level. I think it will be increasingly meaningless to try and do it as a single country. On SMEs, on Matt's question, that's another whole science, isn't it? Like, what can government usefully do and it be good value for money to support SMEs to take up technology? We know Help to Grow Digital was a standard failure, so don't just give them vouchers to buy software is one answer. But I do think there is a role for government there, partly in having clarity about the stance towards the technology and kind of, laying down those very basic rules of the road, like the data protection stuff, and also showing some leadership in the public sector. So when you see and hear about public sector use cases, I think that feeds into a general sense of kind of interest and acceptance of the technology that the rest of the economy then does notice. And the question about the combination of AI with other technologies, I thought was also really pertinent as well, in that I think that might be where the UK's advantage or comparative advantage in industrial strategy terms lies. So, we may not be the home of all the large model developers, but we have deep expertise in other technical sectors, and seeing AI tools combined with biotech or advanced materials is where I think you will see a lot of innovation and growth coming over the next few years.
Yeah, it's something that came out a lot when we were thinking about this model for a new AI strategy that we presented. It was thinking about AI for the day-to-day economy, but also AI for those innovation-intensive businesses in other sectors, because they have such specific requirements, and that cross-convergence is hugely important. Saira, I'm going to give the final word to you to reflect on the questions.
Very much from that regulation perspective, I don't think we've missed the boat. I think it's working collaboratively with partners in the US and the EU and making sure that it is a kind of a comprehensive AI strategy going forward for regulation. It doesn't make sense for us all to kind of be doing our own things completely, but at the same time leaving that space open for innovation. And that last question, just about taking AI with other kind of technologies as well, I think it's really exciting to see some of the new innovations. So another part of my Imperial job, working in the Security Sciences Institute, and actually working at a NATO Innovation Centre, looking at cybersecurity and AI and bringing health tech into it as well. It's amazing what innovators are kind of coming up with, and I think really kind of investing in that R&D position will really kind of harness our kind of strength in terms of universities, life sciences, etc., to make sure we have that advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a completely key point. I think a lot in our case studies about where it's being applied. But brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this panel. It's also great to be the token man on an AI panel, because very often it's quite male-dominated. So can I have a massive round of applause for our panellists?